Hi World History. Today we're going to be talking about a really exciting movement in Europe that happens between 1300 and 1600 called the Renaissance. The Renaissance is a rebirth of art and learning that flourishes all throughout the continent. And I really want you to pay special attention to that word rebirth. To have a rebirth, you had an original birth, and then maybe something went wrong, maybe a death, maybe a problem, and then a rebirth. So what we're going to be looking at here is this rebirth. So a couple things I want you to think about is, what sort of things do they view as the original birth? What kind of went wrong over time? And then why is this a rebirth? So as we talk, we're going to be looking for certain goals. So a few things that I want you to pay attention to. First of all, what are some of the differences here in movements of art between the period that came before, maybe this bad period in European history, this medieval period, this Middle Ages period, and the Renaissance? So we'll look at art from both. Also, I want you to pay attention to what are some important movements and some important figures, so some important people from the Renaissance. There's some big names, and my guess is that you have heard of some of them before now. And lastly, how is the Northern Renaissance, which takes place in places like England, Belgium, France, Germany, how is that Renaissance different than the Renaissance that maybe people might be more familiar with, which is the Italian Renaissance? So we'll answer all three of those questions and throw in some other ideas as we go along, but pay special attention for those. Okay, so first of all, the Renaissance looked very different depending on where you are coming from. So there's two major Renaissances. One here is in Italy. This is the one that takes place first. So it starts around 1300, goes all the way to about 1600. But the focus is mostly visual arts. So things like painting, sculpture, some invention, things of that nature, things that you can look at. Later, we're also going to look at how that's different than the Northern Renaissance. So Northern Renaissance more up here in Europe, so England, France, Belgium, Holland, etc. It takes place, coming in about a century later, still ending about 1600. The focus there is more on writing, education, and social change. So where does this start? Why does it happen at all? So I already mentioned there was this highlight in the past, and then kind of this gross, dark death period, and then this rebirth. So the big birth they're looking back on from way long ago was the Greek and Roman period. That was the highlight. But if you think to what we've looked at more recently, we had this Middle Ages period. People forgot how to write. There was lots of wars. There was lots of turmoil. Lots of people were mostly poor farmers. It wasn't a highlight of art's civilization. So in Italy, when we're thinking about how this comes about, there's a lot of different factors, and I can't go into all of them now. But if you remember the bubonic plague, the Black Death sweeping through Italy, hit a lot of these port cities. But when that happened, it wiped out the feudal system. And there was basically a reset button on a lot of pieces of society, including here. And we start having these people that used to be serfs flocking to cities, and trying something new. And we get some families that out of the Black Death become fabulously wealthy. And if you can imagine, what are they doing with all this money? Maybe they're going to start buying things like art. They don't just have to buy food, they can buy pretty things now too. So we get this movement of artists sort of rising up in greater numbers than what we had seen before. And on top of that, individuals have more value. We've seen this already. The serfs aren't just a number anymore. Now they're people that survived the plague, and they have more value. So this all happens starting in Italy. We're going to see some of these early places like Florence rising up. Milan is another big center. Venice. These all become major centers of the Italian Renaissance. So what does this look like compared to what we saw before? That's one of our big questions. How is this a difference from what happened before this? So we're talking about medieval art, that Middle Ages art that they think is kind of like the worst, that they have to be reborn from, into this new, reborn Renaissance art. And so let's look at a couple medieval pieces first to kind of get our feet wet and kind of understand where we're coming from. So here is a very prototypical piece that's medieval. So if you look at it, there's some things you might notice that might kind of stand out to you right away. Now, some things you might realize and some things you might not. So a few things. You might have noticed that it was religious. There's a lot of religious themes here. In fact, the two main characters are Mary and Jesus. So this is what's known in the art history world as a Madonna and Child. That's named for Mary and Jesus, Madonna, Mary. You might have also noticed that there are these little halos, or each one of them has a nimbus around it. That's another way to indicate that the person is holy. As far as artistic style goes, it's not beautiful in the way that we would typically think of that now. It definitely has its merits. It's better than anything I could draw, but it's not very realistic. It doesn't really look like real people. There's not a lot of backdrop or a lot of nature. There's like a little flower they're holding, but there's no real depth to the picture. And there's some real problems with some faces here, especially baby Jesus, who looks like a middle-aged man. So obviously, making an accurate picture of a baby was not important to the artist. We also don't know who painted this. There's not signed at the corner. There's no name that's indicating who made it. So maybe that wasn't important either. Let's look at another picture and see what's similar about it. So this one is also medieval. And when you're looking at it, you might notice some things right away again. So you might notice that it is indeed religious again. The main character is actually a monk, and there might be a couple things that you might notice. He's got his robes on. You might notice the book and some of the religious garb. Some people think that it's Jesus because he's got holes in his hands and his feet, but in this case, it's a monk. He also has some other features that might indicate that he is holy or might be part of a monastery. For example, he's got a very distinctive tonsure haircut up top here. And then surrounded him are panels about his life. Now, this is a sort of artistic piece that would be very helpful if you were trying to teach people that maybe were illiterate about the life of a saint. So you could come up here on a Sunday morning and say, let's look at picture 5. Let's tell this story. Or let's tell picture 2, where St. Francis of Assisi preached to the birds, is what this one is about. So there's lots of different things here, but this would be used for teaching. Now, as far as artistic style goes, it seems like it's got a little bit more going for it than the first one, but this is still definitely medieval. So if you look at it, it's very flat. There's still not a lot of backdrop. There's still not a lot of nature. It's still got some major problems going on as far as what we would view as like a good artist rendition. But again, styles are different. In the medieval period, the focus was on the meaning behind it. It didn't have to look exactly like St. Francis of Assisi. It had to be an object that was workable to be able to use for teaching. So that didactic nature was more important than the way it looked. Let's compare it to a Renaissance piece. So take a look at this picture for a second and think about what about it is the same and what about it is different than the last one. And let me give you a clue. The person in this one is the same person, St. Francis of Assisi, as the one on the picture before. Now there's some definite differences here. The real only similarity is that it's about the same person. It's about a monk. That's pretty famous. But the differences are pretty astounding. We've got, obviously he's in the picture, but he's not the focus of the picture. We've got tons of depth going all the way back here. We've got lots of detail. We've got nature. We see him as almost being like an excuse for the picture, not necessarily the main focus. I mean, he is the center point, but it seems kind of like they wanted to just paint a landscape that was really pretty. So this right here is an example of a Renaissance piece of work. You see the detail, you see the depth, you see the perspective. So you're going to see a lot of things where it looks more realistic. It looks more like a photo than what you would see in a medieval picture. So I have some of those things listed here. It's 3D, the details included, the background is important. And again, that idea of perspective being so important included in this particular picture compared to the ones prior. So you're already seeing the differences here between medieval artwork and Renaissance artwork. Okay, so what's going on with this whole big idea of the Renaissance? What's the focus? Where are they trying to get to? Again, they are trying to reflect on the sources. So they want to go back to the original sources. Let's forget about that time period in the middle, that Middle Ages, those medieval periods where it was not great. Let's go back to the highlight, the golden ages of Europe, which was the Greek and Roman time period. So you're going to get people like this guy over here, Petrarch, who's got some interesting fashion choices in life, which we are going to let him run with. And he and his friends started going back to ancient texts. So what were the Romans writing about? What were the Greeks writing about? Because when you think about it, there was all these people in Europe around the time of the beginning of the Renaissance, and they looked around them, and there was all these really cool old buildings that were huge and like designed in crazy ways. There was these giant aqueducts, there were domes, there was all this stuff that people didn't even know how to make anymore. People forgot how to do architecture. People forgot how to read. And so people like Petrarch and his friends actually went grave robbing to find a lot of these ancient books. They literally went into graves, took the books, and then went and read them. And that really inspired them to start writing and to start exploring more things and starting to really bring back some of that old knowledge. So Dante wrote a lot of books. Petrarch, who we just mentioned, Boccaccio, all three of them start focusing on some major themes that we're going to see popping up throughout the Renaissance, including humanism, so focusing on the individual. The individual is now important. You're not just a cog in the machine. You're not just a member of the church. You yourself are important because you're an individual. And they also start doing things that make the individual able to think on their own 2 feet outside of any kind of organization. So one of those things is they start writing in what's known as the vernacular language. So the vernacular is the language that people actually speak. So if you are living in Germany, they would be writing in German, not in Latin, because it's hard enough to learn how to read in one language if you hadn't learned how to read at that point, much less to learn another language and then learn how to read in that language. So they said, let's just make it easier. If people naturally speak English, let's write in English. If people speak Italian, let's write in Italian. And they also started writing about more secular topics, things that did not have to do with church. So secular means non-religious. So that is also a major change. Now, we're going to look here at a few different Renaissance men. These are people that have skills in many areas. They are masters of multiple areas. So a lot of the ones in the Italian Renaissance are masters in both sculpture and painting, are the two that generally get the most attention. So a few that you may have heard of before, one is Raphael. He does a lot of sculpture and painting. I think he's interesting because he really emphasizes humanism, that idea that the individual matters that I was just mentioning. So he's an example. We actually have a self-portrait of Raphael, which is surprising because we already saw, like in the medieval pictures, we don't even know who did those. And here we have someone that's not just signing their own paintings. We have someone that thinks that people in the future are going to want to know what he looks like. So he's saying, I'm important, and I'm going to show that value through my work. We're also going to start seeing a mixing of secular and religious. So one of his most famous paintings is this one, School of Athens. It's actually in the Vatican, which is the center of the Roman Catholic Church, but it's all of Greek philosophers who lived and wrote like 300 years before Jesus was even born. So none of them were Christian. So you've got non-Christian philosophers that lived before Jesus painted on the walls of one of the most religious buildings in the world. It's a really interesting mix. Another person that you've probably heard of is Michelangelo. Did lots of sculpture, so like this is out of one single piece of marble, and also a lot of paintings. So you might be familiar with his work on the Sistine Chapel. All three of those are from the Sistine Chapel. Very impressive work, very skilled artist, for sure. The last one I want to talk about is a guy named Leonardo da Vinci. He is a true Renaissance man. He is not just good at one thing or two things. He definitely does painting, so he's good at here's the Mona Lisa. That's his most famous painting. He does sculpture. He studies biology. He studies how would a baby be situated, a fetus be situated within the mother's womb? What are the perfect proportions for a body? But on top of that, he does investigations into different inventions. He designs a helicopter. He designs a submarine. He does all kinds of stuff. So All of these people are true Renaissance men.